Welcome to this sew along. I've cut out all of my pieces. I've cut out a pair of fronts, a pair of backs, and 2 pairs of pocket pieces. The fabric recommendations for this pattern are a tencel or a Cupro, something with a lot of drape to it. And so what I highly recommend you do is do a test with your iron on a scrap piece. So this is just a scrap piece, and you can see where I pressed this without a press cloth, and it marks super easily. These fabrics really do tend to mark quite easily, so I would always recommend using a press cloth with them. Testing on a scrap piece. I've even had it where it marks on the wrong side. It'll mark like the right side when you press on the wrong side, so don't take any chances, just use a press cloth. The first thing I've done is I had some inch wide pieces of fusible interfacing, and I always like to lay my pieces out in mirror images. So these are the 2 fronts. You can see the crotch here and crotch here, and so I've laid it out, you know, as though they were sitting on a body. This is the wrong side up, and I have fused the interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric between those upper 2 notches. So there's a notch here, don't know if you can see that, and a notch down here. And I have just fused the interfacing, cut it to length and fused it to the wrong sides of the fronts between the top 2 notches. That's just to stop that pocket from stretching out. The next thing is I have my waistband piece here. And you can find the central notch on that. You can see this fabric's going to fray a lot. So there's the center notch here, and then this side, the seam notch, and another seam notch at this end here. I've cut my interfacing, and I'm going to fuse that into the middle of the waistband like this. This is just so that there's no interfacing in the seam allowances, and I'm going to fuse that on next. That's the next thing I'm going to do. This is the waistband piece. This is the notch in the center, and then the seam notch on this end, and the seam notch here. I have just fused that interfacing onto the middle part of that. It just keeps the seam allowances free of interfacing. So I've done that, and I've fused the pockets. You can see I have a pocket piece here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this curved edge of the pocket piece. So just this curved edge of the pocket. You can leave this edge and the top edge unfinished. For now, you can see my fabric's really fraying, but I think it'll be okay as long as I handle it carefully. So here's my front piece, and I've got my pocket piece here that I've finished the edge of. Now on this straight edge of the pocket, so this side of the pocket, there are a couple of notches, and they correspond with notches on the front piece here, and the edge that we interfaced. So I'm gonna align those notches. Align that side piece, and I'm just going to pop a couple of pins in. Oops, I totally missed that one. Let's try again. There we go. So, what we need to do is stitch our seam allowance across here and make it into like a box shape. So we're going to stitch up here, across at 1/2 inch, and down. I find it actually easiest to mark it with some tailor's chalk or some other form of marking. So I did that on this one and I'll show you. Okay, so I've marked it with chalk, that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So it's pretty important that you keep pretty strict with that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to stitch this box shape, half a box really. Right, so I've sewn that box. Trying to focus on it. Yeah, there we go. So I've sewn it as accurately as I can. The next step is I'm going to clip into these corners. So if you have sewn it and it's, you know, maybe not quite as accurate as you would like it to be, go ahead and resew it. It's really, really important. So that's that corner. Just making sure I'm only clipping through these 2 layers. I'm going to clip into that corner, making sure I'm not clipping through the stitching, but I'm clipping as closely as I can. This one's fraying a bit. Right, so now what I'm going to do is flip that through. So you have the side part of the box, I suppose, and you have this long part of the box. So what you're going to do is press it across and over and understitch just this long part of the box. So make sure you don't extend past where you turned the corner. But just understitch just this bit. Even if you understitch a little bit less, it's better than too much, okay? So I have understitched just that edge there, you can see. Now I'm going to just fold it through and I'm going to press it open. Sorry, not open, over. Because you clipped into this side bit, you should be able to make it into you know, a box shape like this. So we're going to press that into this shape because you clipped into those corners. If you find that it's not pressing a nice corner, just make sure you're clipping deeply enough, but just be careful not to clip through your stitching. Here's one I prepared earlier. I really like saying that. It's like being on a cooking show. So you can see that that's the front of the pants. That's that pocket edge and that box shape. So that part is done. The next thing is we're going to top stitch another box shape just around here. So with top stitching, make sure you lengthen your stitch length a little bit. I like to use a stitch length of 3 for top stitching. That's because top stitching is supposed to be visible and you want to be able to see each individual stitch. That's just kind of the standard, industry standard. So just top stitch this shape. You don't have to do that, but I think it stabilizes it even more. I think it's always a good thing to do. So I'm going to do that and then come back. Okay, so I top stitched on the right side. This is the wrong side now. I have that pocket piece. And then I'm going to take my other pocket piece that goes with it and lay it on top. So I'm going to stitch around this curved edge with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance or 1 centimeter. But I'm just going to sew just the pocket pieces together. So I'm not sewing it to the front. So I'm just going to show you how I'll pin it. I'll just match these edges of the pocket. And you'll pin it all the way around. There's a notch in here to match. You should be able to still find that in your serging, hopefully. If not, you can just compare it to your pattern piece and just mark it on there. Just make sure you're matching, okay? When I get to this edge, just gonna make sure that they are free from the front, so not attaching them to the front, just keeping them nice and separate. So I'm gonna sew that. If you are somebody who carries very heavy things in your pocket, you could sew it twice just for safekeeping. But to be honest, like these are pretty lightweight pants, so I wouldn't recommend carrying around, I don't know, bottles of wine or something in your pocket. So these aren't the pants for those. So anyway, sew this around here with a 1 centimeter or a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so we have sewn our pocket. So this, make sure your pocket is free from the front. You can hang free on the right side. It looks lovely. That's the right side. So we have this, we have this nice pocket opening to put our hand in. Now the next step is to stay stitch it together. So that's an important step because, you know, there's all these layers of fabric here, and when we're sewing the long side seam, you know, we don't want to be too worried about that. We don't want the front from coming apart. So, you know, just take these 3 corners and match them. Make sure they're lying nice and flat. If they're not, you can just, you know, adjust. You can see that one of my layers is a little bit further up. That's okay. I'm just going to leave it like that. The important thing is that it's sitting nice and flat. And pop a pin in there to show you. And then I'm just making sure all of this is lying nice and flat. And I'm going to pop a pin in the other end. So I'm going to, you know what, I'll put another pin in the middle because this fabric does not want to sit. There we go. So I'm going to stay stitch just a 1/4 inch from the edge, you know, very close to the edge, just to hold it together. Across this top edge down here. And also there's this little kind of extra flappy bit down here. I'm going to just stay stitch this, just this short bit here down as well. So I'm going to do that, and then we're going to do the big bias seam. So yeah. Okay, so this is the step in the process that's maybe the hardest. It's not really that hard, but I do recommend that you get a whole bunch of pins and just do it carefully. So we're going to pin the back piece with the long diagonal cut line to the front piece. So I'm going right sides together. Now, I already advised you to cut all the notches in there. That's because this very long bias cut has the tendency to stretch, especially in these slinky fabrics. So I warned you. Some patterns might have you stay stitch that. Some people might stay stitch it, but I don't think it's an issue because we haven't had to handle it until now. So just handle it gently. If it's going to make you feel more secure to stay stitch it, please go ahead. So I'm just going to start at the top, and I'm just handling it as gently as possible. So I'm going to start by matching this notch to the top of the pocket, and we'll come back and revisit that pocket in just a second, but I just want to get the basics secured. And you can see I'm not really pulling it, I'm just allowing it to sit. Ooh, so freeing. Then this second notch with the bottom of the pocket. So I'm right sides together here. And then I'll just travel down and find the next notch. Okay, again, I'm not stretching it, I'm not pulling it, I'm just handling it really delicately, matching that notch. If you've made any of my patterns before, you may have noticed I don't notch a whole bunch. So I've notched quite a lot in this pattern, so let that guide you. That they're important on this one. Then we have, you can see there's a opposite curves here, and matching the bottom. Okay. Oh, it's being so slippery. Here we go. Okay. Now, this is probably the tricky bit. The only tricky bit is matching these non-matching curves. So just place them on top of each other. Don't stretch anything. Things should align. So when you're faced with something like this, like a big outer curve and an inner curve, just find the center, okay, and pin in the center. and then match it by, you might want to bend it slightly, okay? And I can feel with my fingers behind here like this that there's no puckers, and I'll pop a pin. So this is the bit where you're probably going to need the most pins, is just on these opposite curves. This is where it kind of curves around your leg. And just ease it in, but no puckers. It should match pretty well. Okay. Here's a section between two notches. You can pop a pin there or not, up to you. Okay, if you're going to pop a pin in, just hold them so they're flush. Find the center point of both of them, of both the upper and the lower layer. So that's what I suppose I mean. Okay, same here. Okay, you can see this has slightly, wants to stretch out a bit. It's okay. We're just going to match the middle and pin. Okay, let's go back to that pocket. So here's that pocket here. When we sew, we're going to sew this seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, or 1.3 centimeters, including over here, but we do not, I repeat, do not want to catch this, our pocket edge, or we'll be sewing our pocket closed. So at this point, for the pocket opening, I recommend pinning it with your pins this way. Okay, and that way I can just feel, you can probably see the bump that's the pocket is nice and out of the way. Yeah, we want the pocket to be nice and out of the way. The other thing that's important is, if you can see through here, just the shadow, this is where that V is of that pocket opening, right? Just that corner. To be really precise, we want to hit that corner right on with our stitching. So you can pop a pin in, you can put a pin mark like this, you can get a little bit of chalk and mark that. Okay, so when I sew, even if it's not quite 1/2 inch, I want to hit that exactly and then sew across. So just kind of, it's like doing like a crayon rubbing or something. Okay, so I want to hit exactly here as I go across. Right, so now I've got my long seam pinned, and I'm going to sew that with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to finish those edges together and press them. I'm gonna, when I press them, whoops, I'm gonna press them down. So away from the center front is what I mean. So here's that seam there, and the pocket just here. So you can see, if all goes well, your corner there kind of becomes hidden underneath, you know, that box shape that you sewed before. I didn't do a very good job there. So I could go ahead and like unpick a couple of stitches. I probably won't bother, to be honest. And then this was one of those fabrics that is really hard to press. It was marking really badly with the seam allowance. So I had to go back and kind of press like underneath here to press out that. Fortunately, it did press out. Even though I was using a press cloth on the wrong side, it was still doing it. Can you believe that? Anyway, I don't know if you've ever been on a long drive and you've seen a sign that says, you know, no gas for 500 kilometers or something like that, no petrol. This is one of those moments. So this is the last time that you will have, the last chance that you'll have to give your fabric a really good press. So make sure that your seam allowance is pressed away from, like, seam pressed backwards. I think I said down the last time, but I meant up or towards the back. Anyway, towards the back, so away from the pocket. So you can see this is the pocket. I've got all the seam allowances going that way. Okay, so once you've done that, turn it over so you've got the right sides up, and we're going to sew the inseams. So this is the inseam here and the other inseam. Okay, going to pin that together. sew with a 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter seam allowance down there. I'm going to finish the edges together and press them towards the back. Okay, so I have a right and a left pant leg here. So now I need to sew the crotch seam. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is to turn one of the legs inside out. And put, so this one's the right way, sorry, turn it the right way out is what I mean, and put that one inside the one that is the right side out. So these are the crotch, this is the inseams, I'm matching them at the crotch. Oops, sorry, just bumped the camera there. So I like to put a pin through at my stitching line, right on the stitching. Make sure it's matching, and it's not, so that's not going to match. So I'll do it again. So I've got it right on the stitch there, pretty close. Yeah, good. Okay. And then I'm going to pin and sew the rest of the crotch seam. There are notches in your pattern to help match the crotch, which I didn't actually cut in mine. But the other notches are really important. Okay, so sew this crotch seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if I sew it here, then what I like to do is I like to do a second row of stitching just outside of that, a safety stitch, just in case we burst through a little bit of our stitching. We just want like an insurance. And then finish those edges together and press them to one side. Okay, so now we're going to apply the waistband. Here's my waistband here. I folded it in half, right sides together, and I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch seam along the center back here, and then I'm going to press that open. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold one edge up 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to press that. So I've pressed one edge up. You might find it's easiest to just sew a line of stitching 1 centimeter away from the edge to give you something to press against. I did that and it really helped. Now we're going to pin it onto our pants. So there's 3 notches. The central notch is for the center front. So I'm going to start by matching and pinning that to the center front. Then the next notch over is for that seam. It's not really a side seam, it's I don't know what it is, a diagonal seam. So between the 2 seams, not side seams, is where the front will be flat. So that's where we won't have any elastic. So just go ahead and pin that all the way around, and then matching your seam on your waistband to the center back. So do that, pin it all the way around, and then sew it with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. The reason we do that is because we want as little bulk as possible in a waistband. So I'm going to sew that on and then come back. Right, so I've sewn the waistband on, and I have pressed the seam allowances up into that waistband, so towards the waistband. We're going to prepare to stitch in the ditch now. So I'm going to turn my garment, so I'm going from the right side this time. So I'm going to just fold that waistband down and over so it just covers that line of stitching. So the line of stitching that we just did, it's just going to cover that. From the right side, we're going to pin and stitch in the ditch. So I'm just going to pin in the ditch, and then check on the back to make sure I've caught it, just the edge, like that. I'm going to do that all the way around. So again, just folding it over, so it's just over that line of stitching, holding it, pinning it, and stitching in the ditch. I'm going to pin all the way around, including the interface part of the waistband. At this seam here, I'm going to put a vertical pin here, and then one just a couple of inches next to it. When I do my stitching, so I'm going to do this on both sides, on both the left and the right sides. I'm going to add, leave this little bit unstitched. So I'll be stitching in the ditch across the front and across the back, but there'll be a little gap of a couple of inches on each side, and that's so we can thread our elastic. So I'm going to pin all the way around, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch. And what that means is I'm just going to stitch right in this ditch between the waistband and the garment, so you can't really see it. It's going to hide in there, and it's just going to catch that waistband down on the inside at the same time. Okay, so I've stitched in the ditch and I left a gap, so you can see here where the threads are, that's my space. I also went ahead and pressed the waistband in half, and you can see that on the inside we've got a nice clean finish there. So this front part is going to be flat, and then we're going to insert elastic just into the back part. So I'm going to start off by pulling off some elastic off I have a roll of it, so. And I'm just putting a large safety pin on the end. And I'm just going to thread it through just the back part. Just making sure I'm not twisting it as I'm going through. You see how that wants to twist, so I just want to make sure it's staying nice and flat in there. Untwisting. Okay, when I get to this other opening, I'm just gonna bring the elastic out just a short way. I'm gonna take off the safety pin. And so this is that seam there. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna thread this back into the hole and extend it into the front just a little ways. So the elastic is ending about here. I think I want it up inside just a little bit more. So the elastic is finishing about here, and that's my seam here. So I'm going to pin here, flush with this, in line with this seam. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch back and forth on this quite a few times. My elastic's ending here. I'm going to actually push it through a bit more. That's better. So I'm going to go back and forth here a few times, and then I'm going to close this stitch, this gap by stitching in the ditch. That's what I'm going to do, and I'm still attached to my roll of elastic here, but that's okay. Okay, so did my vertical stitching here, closed up that gap there, and then I put the pants on and I actually cinched up the elastic to how tight I wanted it and marked it with a pin. Now, you really want to be careful here that you do not let this go and let it like go into the casing, because it's going to be really hard to get out. So I'm going to cut the elastic, holding onto it, and then I'm going to just insert it, making sure it's not twisted. I'm going to insert it into that other end just as I did on the first side. So I'm just putting it into the slightly into the front, holding it really tight. Okay, oops, sorry, I bumped you. So your elastic's extending to about here. That's the seam. I'm gonna pin it, and I'm gonna do the same thing. Sew vertically here and then sew up that gap. Then all you have to do is hem your pants and you are done. So I hope you've enjoyed this sew along, and hope you enjoy your pants. So please post them on Instagram so we can see them.